It is very good to see everybody here this morning. You know when you've been singing a hymn a certain way your entire life, and then you switch songbooks and something has changed about the lyrics? Maybe it's just a single word or a phrase, but when you've been singing a song your whole life, it sure stands out, even the smallest change. That happened recently when we sang An Empty Mansion, which is number 741. And it's in the chorus. You might have noticed it also if you've been singing out of hymns for worship your whole life like I have. And the chorus says, and it's a great song, the lyrics are very wonderful, by the way, because it puts the emphasis not on the mansion itself and the streets of gold, which is imagery that's meant to be symbolic, not that we're literally going to be walking on streets of gold and walking through pearly gates. It's meant to show the value of heaven, the inestimable value of heaven. But in the chorus it says, "There's a mansion now empty, just waiting for me, at the end of life's troublesome way." And here's where the change was. "Many friends and dear loved ones will welcome me there, near the door of that mansion someday." And perhaps it's just because it's different than the old version that I noticed it, but there was something about it when we read it the other day. When we sang it, I believe it was last week, it just really struck a chord with me. And every time we went through the chorus, I thought in my own mind of the people that I'm excited to see in heaven. And is that a vain desire? Is that superficial or superfluous? And I don't think so. What I want to talk about this morning is the welcome that we're going to receive in heaven. Not just the welcome by God and His Son and the Spirit, but the welcome that we'll receive by all the saints who have gone before us. I thought about my grandpa who passed away, my grandmother, faithful Christians, workers in the kingdom. I thought about Timothy Barge. I thought about loved ones and friends and family, people that I'd known for many years and people that I had only known for a few years. Saints who went before me. And they'll welcome us into the eternal abode. So, separation and death. One of the greatest pains that we have to face, if not the greatest pain that we have to face. So when we read in An Empty Mansion of the reunion that we're going to have with people, I wonder if that seems trivial to some. After all, grief is itself viewed as a painful fact of life. We lose people, and that is what it is, and there's no way of getting around that. The Apostle Paul addresses it briefly in 1 Thessalonians chapter 4. In the context of the resurrection and the day of judgment, he has this to say in verses 13 and 14, "But we do not want you to be uninformed, brethren, about those who are asleep." And what he means by that is those who have passed away. Spiritually speaking, they're only asleep now, because they will be reawakened at one point. "I don't want you to be uninformed, brethren, about those who are asleep, that you may not grieve, as do the rest who have no hope. For if we believe that Jesus died and rose again, even so God will bring with Him those who have fallen asleep in Jesus." And Paul wrote those as comforting words. It's not just trivial information, but it's very comforting to us to know that those we love who are saints, we will get to see them again. And it is only the uninformed and the unbelieving who feel as if death is the greatest separation, one that can never, ever again be crossed. But it talks about death also in Genesis chapter 23 and verse 2, speaking of the death of Sarah, Abraham's long-time wife, friend, and companion. And he grieved over her. It talks about death in Genesis chapter 49 as well. And I want to notice that briefly here. Go to Genesis chapter 49 and go ahead and cross the bridge from chapter 49 into chapter 50. If you pick up here, beginning in verse 33, where it says, "When Jacob finished charging his sons, he drew his feet into the bed and breathed his last and was gathered to his people." Notice that the way his death is described as being gathered to his people. Yes, Jacob also was gathered to God. And yes, Jacob would finally have that spiritual communion with God in death, but it's described as being gathered to his people, as a reunion with his people. And it goes on to say in chapter 50 in verse 1, "So Joseph fell on his father's face and wept over him, and he kissed him." For Jacob, it was being gathered to his people. For Joseph, it was separation, grief, and loss. Matthew chapter 5 and verse 4, Jesus said in the Sermon on the Mount, in the Beatitudes, he says, "Blessed are those who mourn, for they shall be comforted." And I wonder why. Now, there might be ways that you are comforted in this life, and I think that's a legitimate interpretation of that beatitude. But perhaps you could also see those who mourn as being comforted in the sense that when you put your trust and your faith in God, you will see once again all of the saints who've gone before you. That if you're mourning over a fellow Christian who has passed away, you will be comforted in this life, most especially in the next life as well. Understanding grief in a personal, experiential way was one of the key components of the mission of Jesus when He came to serve in this world. He's prophetically called in Isaiah 53 the man of sorrows and one who was acquainted with grief. Now, I know that God is omnipotent. God knows all things. But there was something about grief that God could only know if God came in the flesh. There was something about the experience of grief firsthand. To not just know grief in a technical sense, but to know grief in a personal sense. Jesus could only know grief in that way if He came to this earth and lived as a human being. And He saw friends and family pass away and faced death Himself in the cross. And the reason why I say that is because of what we read in Hebrews chapter 2. That there was something about coming to this world that Jesus had to do in order to truly know, to truly understand in that experiential way what death and loss and grief really mean. We pick up here in Hebrews chapter 2 and verse 14. "Since then the children share in flesh and blood, He Himself likewise also partook of the same, that through death He might render powerless him who had the power of death, that is, the devil. And in verse 15, that He might deliver those who through fear of death were subject to slavery all their lives." Now it is for this reason, it says in verse 17, that He had to be made like His brethren in all things. He had to be made like His brethren. He had to be a living, breathing human being in order to understand what it was like to be a living, breathing human being. So in verse 17, He had to be made like His brethren in all things, that He might become a merciful and faithful high priest in things pertaining to God, to make propitiation for the sins of the people. And I think verse 18 really hits us close to home. "For since He Himself was tempted in that which He suffered, He is able to come to the aid of those who are tempted." Now I know it talks about temptation, but I think you could equally say that because He faced death the way that we face death, He understands it when we suffer as a result of it. Because He faced grief and loss and suffering, He understands us when we face grief and loss and suffering. Add to that chapter 5, verses 7 through 9 of the same book, Hebrews. "In the days of His flesh He offered up both prayers and supplications with loud crying and tears to the one able to save Him from death. And He was heard because of His piety. Although He was a son, He learned obedience from the things in which He suffered. And having been made perfect, He became to all those who obey Him the source of eternal salvation." Rather than being aloof or indifferent to the problem of grief, Jesus embodied it. Jesus embraced it. And Jesus jumped into grief head first so that Isaiah's prophecy came true to the utmost. Jesus didn't just understand grief. Jesus is the greatest expert on grief in all of human history. He is the man of sorrows, acquainted with grief as if grief was his very best friend. Now we see this played out in John chapter 11, don't we? When one of his very best friends passes away, and we see the grief of Jesus. There was a man in Bethany named Lazarus, and he had two sisters, and Jesus was acquainted with the three of them. He had spent time with them in times past, and they were close friends. In John chapter 11, Jesus learns that Lazarus has become sick, and it is a sickness that may result in his death. He's called for then by the two sisters, and he delays. He delays on purpose, mind you. And his disciples wonder why they're taking so long to get to Bethany. And he says that, don't worry, this sickness is not unto death, because God needs to be glorified in what's about to happen. As a result of their delay, they get to Bethany too late, and Lazarus dies. So Jesus encounters the two sisters, Martha first, and let's turn to John chapter 11, and here's where we will begin our reading from this chapter. Pick up here in John chapter 11 and verse 21. So he encounters the first sister, Martha. And Martha said to Jesus in verse 21, Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died. Even now I know that whatever you ask of God, God will give you. But Jesus said to her in verse 23, your brother shall rise again. And Martha said to him, I know that he will rise again in the resurrection on the last day. And I love that, by the way. That's such a mature attitude. And it shows a very mature understanding of spiritual things, doesn't it? Something that a lot of people, a lot of her contemporaries probably didn't get, the idea of the resurrection on the last day, was something that Martha took great comfort in. Keep that in mind, my friends. The resurrection on the last day is a comfort to us. It's a comfort. But Jesus takes it a step further in verse 25 saying, I am the resurrection and the life. He who believes in me shall live, even if he dies. He'll live spiritually forever, even if he dies physically in that temporary way that we all will come to know one of these days. And everyone who lives and believes in me shall never die. He shall never die spiritually. His soul shall live on for all eternity, never to face death again. Do you believe this? He asks of Martha. Do you believe it? Because I suppose the gospel message isn't much of a comfort to us if we don't actually believe it. And we can go to somebody's funeral, even the funeral of a faithful Christian, and we can say all the right things and use all the flowery language. We can eulogize the Christian and pat each other on the back and give each other warm hugs and say, but we'll see them again. But if we don't actually believe it, it's pretty empty comfort, isn't it? You're just being sentimental. And I think Jesus would challenge us as we filed out of the mortuary at every funeral we've ever been to. He would challenge us and say, you've heard it, you've said it, do you actually believe it? Because if you actually believe it, that is the greatest comfort. That is the greatest comfort that you could ever possibly have. To believe in the gospel as the final answer, as the great solution to the problem of pain and death and loss and grief? Do you believe it? Now, as we go through the story in John chapter 11, he goes out to meet the other sister, Mary. And she's been grieving in the house. And everybody's around her comforting her. When she hears that Jesus has arrived, she leaves the house and goes out to him. And everybody follows after her. Everybody follows after her. Now, Jesus learns that Lazarus has been dead for several days and he's been buried. And he says, take me out to the tomb. And this is where we pick up reading here in verse 33. When Jesus saw her, that is Mary, weeping, and the Jews who came with her also weeping, he was deeply moved in spirit and was troubled. Now, I don't think this was the very first time that Jesus ever encountered physical death during his ministry. At some point or another, his earthly father, Joseph, must have passed away. So this isn't the first time that Jesus has been to a funeral. It's not the first time that he's faced death, but perhaps this was the first time somebody really close to him has passed away. Perhaps this is the first time somebody near his age has passed away. And He's looking at death in the face now. Jesus is deeply grieved. He is troubled by what He sees. And it goes on to say in the text, in verse 35, that He wept when they took Him out to the tomb. And it said in verse 38 that Jesus, therefore, again, being deeply moved within Him. There was something about this scene that moved Jesus to tears. Something that He had never experienced before. Something that He had to face. And I believe that's where all this comes into play, why Jesus had to come to earth. The omnipotent God had to learn something about what it means to be a human and face death. He had to face His own death, and He had to face death in the lives of the people that He loved and cared about most. Jesus was moved by death. And the only comfort for Him was the knowledge of the resurrection. He had the power to raise Lazarus from the dead, and He also has the power to raise everybody else from the dead. Some, of course, are raised up to a resurrection of judgment, while others are raised up to a resurrection of life, as Jesus Himself explained earlier in the Gospel of John. But let's move on here, because I think that we have some misconceptions about heaven that we need to deal with. Some of us believe that heaven is nothing more than the experiences that we're going to have there. And if you polled the typical person, not just the typical Christian, but probably the typical believer of whatever stripe, whatever kind, whatever denomination, most people probably think that heaven is going to be some kind of tailor-made experience to make you happy. Like heaven is going to be eternal Disneyland. Well, what's going to be in heaven? What are you most excited about heaven? In heaven, I'm just going to eat whatever I want. So heaven is kind of like an eternal Outback Steakhouse. Bloomin' onions for all eternity. And you never get fat from it. And you never get heartburn. It's just eternal Outback Steakhouse. I was going to put a picture of Golden Corral. But if heaven is like Golden Corral, I don't want to go there. But other people, well, what are you most excited about heaven? In heaven, I'm going to get to do all the things I've always wanted to do. I get to do all the things that I never had the time to do in this life. I'm finally going to get to learn to play golf. I'm going to take up golfing in heaven. You know, it's like, if heaven is just eternal golf, don't you think you're going to get bored with that eventually? Oh, no, not me. No, not me. Are you sure? Don't you think any activity eventually is going to get old if you do it for all eternity? Well, what are you most excited about in heaven? I think heaven is just, it's going to be like being surrounded by fluffy golden doodle puppies or something like that. Okay. Is heaven just a place? Is heaven just the scenery? Is heaven just experiences? Is heaven just things? The other misconception, though, is maybe an opposite extreme. So we go from one extreme of heaven is nothing but places and experiences and things, all the way to the opposite extreme of heaven is nothing but being a spectator to the glory of Jesus. And for all eternity, we're just going to stare up at Jesus on a pedestal. And that's all we're going to do for all eternity. Now, don't get me wrong. Experiencing the glory of the Lamb of God firsthand is a very big part of heaven, if not the biggest part of heaven. And we will be enthralled by it, my friends. But I don't believe that heaven is just going to be an eternity of staring at Jesus sitting on a pedestal. As if heaven is nothing but an eternal fireworks show on the 4th of July. Now, this is the whole point of this lesson, if you're wondering where I've been going with all of this. Heaven is not experiences. Heaven is not places. Heaven is not things and stuff. And heaven is not just being a spectator to something. Heaven is relationship. Eternal, perfect, sinless, unimpeded relationship. Now, it is relationship with the divine in a way that we cannot possibly comprehend in this life. I've always loved the way that the Apostle John puts it in 1 John chapter 3. Notice what he says here in 1 John chapter 3 and verse 2. Beloved, now we are children of God, and it has not appeared as yet what we shall be. We can't comprehend, is what he's saying. We can't comprehend just exactly what our experience is going to be in heaven. Now, we can have some sense of it, and the Bible does a great job of guiding our thinking on it. But to go from being a physical, temporal being to being an eternal, spiritual being, that's just out of our wheelhouse. We just can't comprehend fully what it's going to be. We do not understand as yet what we will be. But he says, we know that when He appears, we shall be like Him, because we shall see Him just as He is. We're going to have a relationship with the divine that we can't even comprehend in this life. There will be an intimacy, there will be a closeness to our relationship to God the Father, to His Son, and to His Spirit that is unlike anything that we can know in this life. Closer than any human relationship. But the relationship is also going to be horizontal. Not only will we share a relationship with the divine above, but we will share a relationship with the saints around us. And again, that is relationship that is unimpeded. Relationship that is beyond comprehension. If you think you can know people in this life, even in the marriage relationship, your relationship to other saints in heaven is incomparable. It is incomparable. Now, relationships in this life are great. Don't get me wrong. I love being married. I enjoy having friends in this life. I adore my children and the relationship that we share as well. But even Jesus said that in the resurrection they are neither married nor given in marriage. So whatever our relationship to each other is going to be in the resurrection exceeds marriage in intimacy. It exceeds marriage in closeness. It exceeds marriage in knowledge and disclosure. We will know each other in the resurrection in a way that we cannot comprehend. And it's not the streets of gold. And it's not the empty mansion that's waiting for us. And it's not pearly gates. And it's not an eternity of golf or eating whatever you want. It's relationship that defines heaven more than anything else. Jesus describes this very thing in John chapter 13. Please turn with me there and notice a few verses here, beginning in verse 36 and then going straight into chapter 14 through verse 3. Simon Peter said to Him, Lord, where are you going? They're all concerned about Jesus leaving them because He's been prophesying many times, especially lately in His ministry, that He was going to go away. Where are you going, Lord? And He said, where I go you cannot follow me now, but you shall follow later. But Peter said, Lord, why can I not follow you right now? I will lay down my life for you. And Jesus said in verse 38, will you lay down your life for me? Great question, right? You talk the talk, but are you going to walk the walk? Will you lay down your life for me? Truly, truly, I say to you, a cock shall not crow until you deny me 3 times. But let not your heart be troubled. Now, that chapter division was invented by man. Some editor came along, or some monk at some point created the verses and the chapter divisions. But if you keep on reading straight through the chapter, verse 1 makes a lot of sense. Because Jesus just told Peter, you will deny me. And at this point, you are not going to be able to follow me where I am going. And what does Peter's face look like right now? That's pretty bad news, isn't it? You are going to deny me and you don't get to follow me where I am going. There will be a separation, a spiritual as well as a physical separation between us. But let not your heart be troubled by that. Believe in God, believe also in me. In my Father's house are many dwelling places. If it were not so, I would have told you, for I go to prepare a place for you. And if I go and prepare a place for you, I will come again. Now, at this point, is Peter excited about having a mansion in heaven? Now, I know that's kind of the language that's used in other translations. New American Standard calls it a dwelling place, an abode, a home. Is Peter excited about having a mansion in heaven? Is there something physical that he's looking forward to? No. This is the way Jesus puts it. If it were not so, I would not have told you, for I go to prepare a place for you. Verse 3, and if I go and prepare a place for you, I will come again and receive you to myself, that where I am, there you may be also. It's being with Jesus that Peter really wants. Now, if Peter had said, in my Father's house there are many cardboard boxes, and I go and prepare a cardboard box for you, that there you may dwell with me and with the Father for eternity. You think Peter would have been okay with a cardboard box in the Father's house if Jesus was there too? It's not about the mansion. It's not about stuff. It's about being with Jesus. Being with Jesus. While heaven should be seen as a place, mind you, a spiritual place, it's a home, an abode, a dwelling place, the empty mansion, so to speak, isn't what is most comforting to the disciples of Jesus right now. It's the assurance that they will be with Him again one day and that the separation is only temporary. And I would ask the question of, what would be the point of heaven if heaven was just about me? What is the joy of having a mansion if I just get to sit in my mansion all to myself? What is the point of having that dwelling place if I'm allowed to just dwell there like an eternal hermit? Separation by death is our greatest fear, as well as our most profound source of pain. So it would make sense then that the answer to that problem is heaven. In the book of Revelation, when heaven is described after all has been said and done, when judgment has come and those that were not faithful are thrown into the lake of fire for all eternity, we see the new Jerusalem coming down from heaven. It is the eternal abode of the saints. And while that place certainly is glorious in appearance, what is most comforting about it to you? Is it the pearly gates? Is it the streets of gold? Or is it what Jesus says? That in that place there shall be no tears, no loss, no suffering, no pain. For all the first things, all the things of the world have passed away and have been replaced by the new heaven and the new earth. Jesus says that where I am, there you may be also. The Apostle Paul put it this way in Philippians chapter 1, verse 23. To stay in this life means good service. It means good work in the kingdom of God. It means serving other people, helping other people, teaching and preaching the gospel. But what was Paul's preference in Philippians 1? To leave this place and to be with the Christ. Because that is so much better. Paul wasn't looking forward to experiences and things and places and stuff. For Paul, heaven was being with Jesus. Now, we're also going to be with each other. We're running out of time here, so I'll just say this briefly. Jesus describes in Matthew chapter 8, verses 10 through 12, heaven as being a great banquet feast. And He says that in that place you will get to sit with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. So it is not inappropriate, it is not unscriptural, it is not a vain thing to say that heaven is not just relationship with Jesus, with the Father, with the Spirit. Heaven is also relationship with the saints. Think about that. You get to spend eternity, not just with God, you get to spend eternity with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. You get to see Gideon, David, John the Baptist, Peter, and Paul, Ruth, Esther, Mary, Elizabeth. You get to meet the great saints. But you also get to meet the saints that you've known personally. Your grandma and grandpa, a father or mother, a brother, a sister, a spouse. They'll welcome us there. Many friends and dear loved ones will welcome me there, says the empty mansion. I look forward to that. Do you? If you're not a Christian, then you really ought to be. You have no hope if you're not. And the only thing waiting for you is a lake of fire. And you will not find solace and comfort in the company that you find in that place. Nobody's going to welcome you there. Jesus describes hell as a dark and empty place where there is weeping and gnashing of teeth. No friendship, no relationship, just regret that you didn't do in this life what you needed to do to prepare for the next. So whatever you need to do, please do it right now. Please come forward as we stand and sing.